Some men raise a glass to celebrate. I raised mine so I'd remember every word they said about my daughter, in a language they never imagined I understood. Smile, Mark. Just smile and pour the wine. That's what I kept telling myself at Field and Main, the restaurant off King Street in downtown Leburg I'd booked 3 weeks in advance because of the view. Rolling hills, split-rail fences, horses grazing behind glass that said, "We belong here," without anyone having to say it out loud. I wanted Julian's parents to feel welcomed. I wanted my daughter Molly to look around that table and see her whole world getting along in one room. I didn't get that. I got a wine list instead. "Mark, is this the Bordeaux you selected?" Jean-Luc asked, holding the bottle like it had personally wronged him. Every word in his accent sounded like a verdict. "Local vineyard, about 20 minutes from here," I said. He set the bottle down like it smelled of something. How resourceful. Beatrice smiled at me the way you'd smile at a child who'd just shown you a crayon drawing. "And what is it you do again, Mark?" "Construction. Contracting, really. I build custom homes." "How practical," she said, and turned back to her wine. I let it go. Molly was laughing at something Julian said, her hand in his, and that was worth every backhanded compliment these two could throw at me over a plate of duck confit. "I've slept in my truck between jobs. I know how to eat condescension with a smile. You do it for the people you love." What I didn't expect was for them to think I couldn't hear the real thing. Here's what nobody at that table knew about me. Not Julian, not his parents, not even Molly, not really. Before I started my own business, I spent 4 years on construction jobs overseas in my 20s, outside Marseille. I didn't learn French in a classroom. I learned it getting yelled at by foremen until I understood every word. I came home fluent, and then I came home quiet about it, because nobody on a job site in Loudoun County cares if you can conjugate a verb. It never mattered, until it did. Halfway through the meal, Jean-Luc leaned toward Beatrice and murmured something in French, with a small laugh at the end. Beatrice, thinking she was safe, answered him in the same language, flipped a switch, easy as that. They thought I was furniture. I kept cutting my chicken. I kept my face still, and I listened. They mocked Molly's dress first, pretty for something off the rack. Then Jean-Luc did an impression of how I'd said charcuterie earlier, and Beatrice laughed into her napkin. Small, cruel, forgivable, almost. Then Beatrice's eyes drifted to the little gallery near the hostess stand, where the restaurant rotated pieces from local craftsmen. There, framed under glass, was a photo of a bookshelf. My bookshelf. The one I'd spent 4 months building for Molly's room when she was 11, out of reclaimed barn oak. I'd sanded every shelf by hand. She kept her horse ribbons on it until she left for college. Beatrice tilted her head at it and said, quiet, amused, "He probably found it at a dump. Americans have no taste. They just bolt cheap wood together and call it craftsmanship." I set my fork down. Not hard, just down. Nobody at that table noticed. Julian was refilling his water. Molly was smiling at her phone. Beatrice took a slow, satisfied sip of wine, pleased with a punchline delivered in a language she thought nobody there could hear. I looked up. Jean-Luc caught my eye, just testing whether the American had noticed anything. I smiled, easy and warm. "You know," I said in English, "I've always thought the things people build with their own hands say more about them than anything they could buy. Don't you agree, Jean-Luc?" He blinked. "Of course." "Good," I said. "I'd hate for anyone at this table to think I don't know the difference between something cheap and something that lasts." That should have been the worst of it. It wasn't. 20 minutes later, over coffee, Beatrice turned to her own son and asked, casual as weather, "Are the papers ready?" Julian didn't look up from his espresso. "Almost. Next week, I think." "Papers. What papers? Ready for what?" I didn't get the rest of it that night. It came later, in pieces. But I got a name, a family trust, and I got a phrase from Jean-Luc that turned my stomach worse than the bookshelf ever could. "Le père est tellement désespéré d'approbation. C'est pathétique." The father is so desperate for approval, it's pathetic. And then Julian, my daughter's fiancé, the man who'd asked for my blessing 4 months earlier with what I'd thought were real tears in his eyes, actually chuckled. "That's why it works. He wants Molly happy so badly he'll sign anything. Told you he's predictable. Then he flipped right back to English, took Molly's hand, and asked if she was having a good time. The best, she said, and kissed his cheek. He wasn't marrying my daughter. He was performing marrying my daughter, and I just watched the rehearsal. Every part of me wanted to stand up right then. But here's the thing about being a father. If you blow up in a restaurant over something your daughter can't even hear, you're not the hero. You're just the controlling dad who ruined her engagement dinner. So I smiled. I paid cash, tipped well, walked them all out to the valet, shook Jean-Luc's hand, told Beatrice the evening had been wonderful. I meant every word, in a way she wouldn't understand until it was too late to matter. I sat in my truck in the parking lot a long time before I turned the key. They thought this was already over. I thought about 4 months of sanding a bookshelf they called garbage. I thought about the word predictable, said about my own daughter like a line item, and I made myself a promise. I wasn't going to say a word yet, but I was going to find out exactly what they thought they were getting away with, and let them explain it to me themselves, in whichever language they were most comfortable using. Molly texted before I even got in the door. Dad, thank you for tonight. It meant everything that you tried so hard with them. She had no idea what I'd heard. It was going to break her heart, but cleaner than what they had planned. That night I called an old buddy from my Lion days, Grant Ferris, now in corporate risk consulting. I need a favor, I told him, and I need you to be very good at what you do. Give them exactly what they expect, a grateful, clueless father-in-law who just wants his girl happy. The next morning I called Molly and offered to have Jean-Luc and Beatrice stay in our guest house for the week, instead of shuttling from their DC hotel. Let them really get a feel for how we do things out here. Molly was thrilled. I wanted a front row seat, and I got one. For the better part of a week, I played the part. I asked Beatrice about her garden in Normandy. I let Jean-Luc correct my grilling technique over Virginia pulled pork. I nodded, smiled, said I'd try his marinade sometime, while cataloging every syllable out of his mouth like evidence, because it was. Thursday night, once they'd turned in, I sat in my truck in the driveway and called Grant back. This one's ugly, Mark, he said. Jean-Luc's import company is a shell. Filed for the French equivalent of restructuring 2 years ago, never recovered. Tax liens stacked on the family estate in Normandy, going back 3 years. Real numbers, not something you fix by selling off a wine cellar. And Julian? Active civil suit against him back home. Failed import-export venture. Took investors down with it. Nothing criminal, but not nothing. And he never told your daughter. Not one word. There's more, Grant said. That trust arrangement they're pushing. It's not estate planning. If they can get a joint trust over your commercial land, especially something structured offshore, that's liquidity. That's collateral. A way to keep the whole thing from collapsing without anyone back home finding out how bad it's gotten. I sat in the dark a long time after we hung up. They hadn't flown 6,000 miles to welcome me into their family. They'd flown here because I owned something they needed. The chance came Sunday at brunch. Jean-Luc set down his coffee, smooth as ever. Julian tells us you own substantial commercial acreage near the highway. In Europe, family wealth is consolidated. We're preparing a joint family trust draft through our estate attorneys. To protect Molly and Julian long-term, we'd like you to review it before the wedding. Family to family, Beatrice added. It's how we protect our children. That sounds real generous, I said, scratching my jaw like a man overwhelmed by big concepts. I build houses. I don't know much about fancy trusts. Why don't your people send the draft straight to me? I'll take a look. I watched the glint of triumph cross Jean-Luc's face. He thought he'd landed the hook. That night, alone in my study, I read through the folder. Irrevocable trust structure. Beneficial interest transfer. Language that might as well have been in French for how little sense it made. I'm a man who reads blueprints upside down in the rain, but I couldn't make heads or tails of this. 20 years of handling my own contracts doesn't like admitting when it's out of its depth. But I thought of Molly signing something like this one day, smiling, thinking it was a wedding gift. I called Roger Callahan, my attorney of 15 years, at 10 at night. Mark Withers calling after 9. This can't be good. I read him 3 lines off the page. A long pause. This isn't a prenup. And it isn't a gift, Roger said, flat and dead serious. It's an offshore cross-collateralization agreement. They've structured it so your commercial property acts as primary guarantor for Jean-Luc's European entity. If his business defaults, which Grant's research says it's about to, offshore lenders get an immediate, unappealable lien on your land. You're not giving Molly a trust fund, Mark. You're signing a confession that makes your life's work pay off their foreign debts. Something in my chest went very still. They weren't trying to marry into my family. They were trying to buy it, using my daughter's wedding day as the vehicle. The next morning I found Jean-Luc on the porch. I read through the folder, I said. It's a lot, but this sounds wonderful for Molly. I want to do this right. Let my family attorney draft a clean master contract, something simple, and we all sign it together at the rehearsal dinner. In front of everyone. I watched surprise flicker into delight on his face. That's a wonderful idea, Mark. Beatrice clasped her hands together when she heard. This means so much to us. It meant a lot to me too, just not the way they thought. The days between that porch conversation and the rehearsal dinner moved slow and fast at once. Roger and I built the real story into something clean and undeniable. The liens, the lawsuit, the buried language in that trust. Grant sent over documentation, translated, notarized, airtight. And every day I kept smiling across the table, kept letting Beatrice correct my pronunciation, kept letting Julian call me Pop with that easy grin, like we were already family, like he hadn't sat 2 weeks earlier and called my daughter predictable to his own parents. Molly floated through those weeks the happiest I'd seen her in years, seating charts, dress fittings, texting me photos of centerpieces like my opinion had ever mattered before. White roses or wildflowers, she asked. I stared at that message a long time. In a week, sweetheart, I'm going to hand you back a life that's actually yours. Wildflowers, I texted. Always. The rehearsal dinner arrived. String lights through the old oaks I'd planted the year Molly was born. White linen, mason jars stuffed with black-eyed Susans. 40 of our closest people passing plates of Virginia ham biscuits. Jean-Luc and Beatrice held court near the head of the table, with champagne I'd bought. For reasons they didn't understand yet. I caught Beatrice leaning toward Julian near the drink table, her voice low, eyes flicking to me across the yard. I didn't need to hear every word. I'd heard enough of these two to fill in the rest, just from the shape of her mouth. Roger stood off to the side in a blazer, nursing a club soda, looking like nothing more than a family friend, and nothing like the man holding the folder that was about to end this. He caught my eye and gave the smallest nod. I looked at Molly, laughing with her college roommates, happier than I'd seen her in years. I'm sorry, sweetheart. I'd rather break your heart now than watch them break it slowly for the rest of your life. I tapped my glass. Conversations dropped off until only the crickets remained. If everyone could give me a minute, I said, standing. I don't love speeches. I'd rather be up on a roof somewhere. But my daughter's getting married in 2 weeks, and I've spent every day since she was born trying to give her a life where she never has to wonder if somebody's telling her the truth. I turned to Jean-Luc and Beatrice. I want to thank you both for coming all this way to be part of this family. That's not a small thing. The pleasure is entirely ours, Mark, Jean-Luc said, gracious, practiced. I'm sure it is, I said, and something in my tone made Beatrice's smile flicker at the edges. Since our guests traveled all the way from Normandy, I went on, I thought it only right to honor them in their own language, especially since they've spent 3 weeks assuming I couldn't understand a single word of it. I looked at Jean-Luc and switched, clean and effortless, into French I hadn't used in 25 years. I watched his glass freeze halfway to his mouth. I watched Beatrice go rigid. For 3 weeks, I said, you spoke of my daughter like a business transaction. You mocked my work, insulted my home, called her predictable, while plotting to steal my land. Julian scrambled up. Mark, stop. Shut up, Julian, I said, cold, and finished in French. I heard every single word. The words landed like a dropped plate. 40 faces turned, first to Jean-Luc and Beatrice, then to me, then slowly to Molly, whose face went from confusion to something breaking. Dad, what? I'm sorry, sweetheart, I said. I couldn't let you find out after the wedding. I laid the folder open on the table. 2 weeks ago, Jean-Luc and Beatrice asked me to sign a family trust. They called it a gift. It was actually a transfer of my commercial property into an offshore holding entity controlled by Jean-Luc Moreau. Gasps rippled down the table. His company back in France is a shell, collapsing for 2 years, with tax liens on the family estate. And Julien, I looked at him now, steady, has an active civil lawsuit against him in France for a failed deal he never once mentioned to the woman he's supposed to marry. That's not, Julien started. I'm not finished. Molly stared at him, waiting the way you wait for someone to prove you wrong about the worst thing you've thought about them. Julian's mouth opened and closed, nothing coming out. Molly stood, slow and deliberate, pulled the ring from her finger, and set it on his plate beside his untouched trout. You called me cheap. You laughed about my father's house. You made me a pawn in your family's scheme. She stepped around the table and stood beside me, shoulder to shoulder, not hiding behind me. I handed Julian a second document. That's an itemized invoice for your family's stay in my guest house, and a formal notice. You'll need to vacate by tomorrow morning. Mark, surely we can discuss. Jean-Luc's voice had gone thin. We discussed plenty, I said. Apparently in 2 languages. I just didn't join in until now. I picked up my glass, took a slow sip, set it back down with a small, deliberate click. Oh, and Jean-Luc, I paid for tonight out of my own pocket. I'd say you're welcome, but we both know you don't mean it when you say thank you. Nobody at that table said another word. There was nothing left to salvage. Not with a folder full of documentation open in front of 40 guests. Not with a man's own words handed back to him in the language he thought made him untouchable. I looked down at Molly. Tears stood in her eyes, but her jaw was set. You ready? I asked. Quiet, just for her. She nodded, and together we walked past the string lights, past the wildflowers in their mason jars, away from a table where 2 people had crossed an ocean to take something from us, and left with nothing but the sound of their own words, finally understood. Molly slipped her hand into mine the way she used to when she was small enough to hand me nails from a coffee can and call it helping. Thank you, Dad, she said, for hearing what I couldn't. Always, sweetheart, I said. Every single word.